Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's a drawing of Rowan Atkinson as Mr. Bean making one of his goofy faces. That's what I'm going to be doing today. Let's get to it. I'm going to be working on this 9 times 12 inches size paper, and the pencils I'm going to be using are Faber-Castell Bit Graphite Matte pencils. So these are the new matte graphite pencils. As for the reference, I'm going to make some slight changes to it. As for the eyes, I'm going to modify them ever so slightly so that they're looking at the viewer a little bit more, and I'm also going to reduce the catch light in the eyes so that it doesn't cover as much of the pupil. I'm also going to simplify the texture of the jacket a little bit because I can't really be bothered with those details. I'm just going to focus on a portrait and do a vignette as I do with most of the portraits. So like I said, these are the new or relatively new matte graphite pencils. I've already done a number of drawings with them, landscapes, animals, portraits. I've also done a review on them. They are similar to conventional graphite pencils except for the fact that they are less shiny or less reflective. They are a little bit more matte. But more or less they behave similarly as graphite pencils. So once the sketch was done, I started working on the hair. And his hair is fairly dark, so I'm going to start with some of my darker pencils. Now the grades with these matte graphite pencils are different than with most of the conventional graphite pencils. So right now I'm working with a 10B, for example, and after that I'm going to throw in a little bit of an even darker 14B. So as you can see, while I'm working, I'm also trying to suggest the shape and the direction of the hair as well. So I'm thinking even when I start blending, there will still be some of that texture left. Some of these lines will still remain visible, so I want to have a nice texture in place. I want to show the direction of the hair so that it doesn't look ugly once I start blending it. And I will be blending mostly with brushes, or at least that is the case with the hair, because then it's easier for me to follow the direction of the hair and the direction of those lines. With the face I'm going to use some other tools as well. So now I'm starting to use a little bit more of the 14B, which is the darkest pencil that I have, and I'm kind of putting in sparingly into some of these darker areas, shadow areas of the hair, trying to break up the hair into some smaller segments and give it a little bit more structure and depth. Now, I often start my portraits by drawing the hair, and when you have a dark hair like this, there are some advantages and disadvantages to that. The disadvantage, I guess, is the fact that you immediately impose those darker values, which may not always be the best choice. Maybe sometimes it's better to start with lighter tones and build them up to darker ones gradually. But one of the things that I find useful is when I draw portraits is when I put those darker bits in place, that kind of forces me to shade the rest of the head, the rest of the face with a bit more value, and that way I can maybe create a greater range of value, more depth, and achieve a feeling of volume in the subject that I'm drawing. But this can also be a little bit frustrating because when you put down something so dark initially, it takes a while for those values to start popping up when you start shading, because the darker values that I put down for the hair are so much darker than the shading that I'm going to do on the face. I'm moving on to the eyebrows now, and another reason why I like to do the eyebrows before shading the face and the forehead is because that's another thing that helps me navigate through the face in terms of the amount of value I need. So when I start drawing these eyebrows, like with the hair, I start with the slightly less dark values and then put some of the darker bits on top. Now as for the eyes, and here I decided to move straight onto this eye while I was working on the eyebrow. As for the eye, I'm going to use a 14B, the darkest one, for the pupil, but I'm already going to try to reserve some white space for the catchlight. So with graphite you can erase it, but it can be difficult to erase with precision, especially with clean edges. So I don't want to be in that situation where I have to depend on my erasers for such small details. So it's better to reserve the white space here. And there's a couple of catchlights here which will make a nice contrast between the pupil and the catchlight itself, as well as the catchlight and the rest of the iris. Naturally, I needed to shade the rest of the eyeball as well, because even though it's white, it's not going to be completely white because it's in the shadow, it's in the eye socket. So there's always a little bit of shadow there, and after all it's a round object, so the lightest part of that round surface is going to be the catchlight itself. So in order for that catchlight to stand out, I have to shade the rest of the eyeball. And now I'm starting to work on the face, and more specifically on the temple and the forehead area, naturally starting from left to right and from top to bottom, which is usually the case with right-handed artists. This is done to minimize smudging, and I tend to stick to this order of doing things, even though obviously sometimes you can go back and forth in different parts of your portrait depending on whether you need to modify something, and there will be those situations naturally because you can't get everything right immediately. One of the blending tools that I like to use in addition to the brushes is a Q-tip. I found that Q-tips work really well with graphite, but they also work pretty well with colored pencils as well, and they are very good for blending these the pencils when I'm working on shading the face. But unlike the brush, they tend to soften the texture a little bit more, which is something that I need to be aware of if I want to retain a little bit more of the texture. So sometimes once I blend with those Q-tips, once I establish the values where I need them, I will go back to add a little bit of texture and detail on top. So you can see I'm already starting to define this forehead in terms of lighter and darker values. You can see that the temple areas and the sides of the head are a little bit darker because they're slightly facing away from the light source, while the forehead area is facing the light source, which is in the front. And I'm also adding some small wrinkles on the forehead, but also you'll notice that the right side of the forehead, our right, appears a little bit darker. That's because the light source, from what I can tell, is moved a little bit more to the left, our left. So the right side of the face and the hair will appear slightly darker than the left. Here I decided to put in some of these darker bits around the jacket and collar area. And I've noticed, even when I was a beginner, that one of the things I always liked doing to speed up the drawing process was putting in those darkest areas, because they kind of help me navigate both through the drawing, both in terms of the proportions and the placement of elements, but also in terms of the amount of value I need in different parts of the drawing. So it's kind of a reference as to, if I put something dark, it's kind of a reference as to how much lighter or darker something next to it needs to be. Here I moved on to the other eye, and like I said, he's making a goofy expression here, so it's going to be tricky achieving both the likeness and keeping that same expression that he's making. And of course I have to shade around the eyes as well, not just these wrinkles, but putting down enough value around them so that I can show that the eye socket area and the area under the eyebrows is just a little bit darker than the area above the eyebrows, which is kind of protruding and needs to be a bit lighter overall. The lower part of the face is also going to appear a bit darker overall than the upper part of the face, and because the upper part of the face, the forehead area, is close to the light source, and also because his chin is kind of tucked in here and the nose is sticking out, so that's the part of the face which is going to be catching more light. I'm shading the right side of the hair here, and you can see that I made it a bit darker overall. And now I'm just going to do the mouth. I'm going to start with a very dark pencil here because I can see some dark values here. Now one of the problems when drawing these darker lines is that people sometimes leave them kind of hanging, just like a line, which you can't really do that because in real life there are no lines. So if you want to create a realistic looking drawing, you have to explain to the viewer what these lines mean in terms of shapes and lighting. So I have to shade around that opening of the mouth, showing what's casting a shadow onto what, and giving it more shape and making more sense out of it. So like I said, this lower part of the face is going to appear a little bit darker overall, but I'm still not quite there, as it's building up the value takes a little bit of time, and this is especially the case when working with graphite. And I have to tell you that these matte graphite pencils are really no different than conventional graphite pencils in terms of the approach to drawing portraits or any other type of drawings, or in terms of speed of shading and drawing portraits, because they are also slow when it comes to building up the values. So it takes a while to build up the values gradually, and you can see that most of the time I'm just going back over some of the areas I've already shaded, adding some additional value. And the way I'm doing that is by cross-hatching and using a tapered stroke most of the time. Sometimes I use different types of the stroke depending on what I need to do or what I'm trying to achieve. But most of the time I shade by using a tapered stroke in a combination with hatching and cross-hatching. So when I shade an area initially, I just hatch using a tapered stroke to establish some base value. Then as I need to make that a bit darker, I just cross-hatch, adding more and more value until I get the most out of the pencil. When I get the most out of the pencil in terms of value, then I have to switch to another pencil if that's not enough, and I have to switch to a darker or softer pencil. So for example, if I shaded a part of the forehead area with a 2B and that ended up looking flat, I shade the sides a little bit with a 6B, making a transition towards that lighter area of the forehead which is just left of the middle, leaving that a little bit lighter. But if the sides are still not dark enough, then I have to move in with something even darker, like an 8B or even a 10B, shading gradually and avoiding using too much pressure. And that's just the way you have to do it. And that's one of the things that I'm kind of always reminded when I switch back to working with graphite from charcoal, because I do most of the work in charcoal, but I occasionally switch back to graphite just for the sake of practice and just so that I wouldn't forget how to use it, and also because I feel that some drawings are better done in graphite. But I'm always reminded how much slower graphite is when it comes to shading. There are also some advantages, because you get some great details and wonderful textures with it, and you have a lot of control when shading. But the truth is that it's a lot slower and that you do need a lot of patience. So what I found myself thinking during the shading process here while I was working on the face was that how flat it looked most of the time, and I just kept pushing myself to add more and more value until I was happy with the appearance of the skin, not just in terms of texture, but mostly in terms of the amount of value and in terms of the volume that I'm conveying to the viewer, because I really want that for it to feel three-dimensional. I want those wrinkles to feel three-dimensional to the viewer, and I really want that nose to stick out. So that was not easy to achieve, and that took a little bit of patience. And on top of that, of course, you have to worry about the likeness and the proportions, and you have to keep checking and double checking your reference photo to make sure that you're not deviating too much from the shape of the subject that you're drawing. Another thing that helps with shading and with building up the value are brushes or your blending tools, because when you blend, especially when you're using brushes like this, you're softening the texture a little bit, but at the same time you're adding a little bit of value to it, because you're pushing that graphite into those lighter spaces where the graphite dust didn't go in, and that allows you to speed up the shading process a little bit so that you don't have to do everything just by hatching and cross-hatching, and that helps a lot. And another thing that's good about brushes is the fact that they help you retain some of the texture. So when you blend with a brush, they're not going to destroy that texture that you try to create. So if you want to create a realistic looking texture of the skin, and if you've put down some details like some wrinkles and moles and things like that, that will not be lost when you use brushes. It'll just be softened a little bit, so that's a good thing. But I had to go back in and add some more texture and some suggestions of that very short facial hair around the mustache and the beard area. Of course, he is more or less clean shaven, but you can still see some suggestions of stubble there. And like I said, this is Rowan Atkinson. If you don't know who the actor is, you've probably seen either the movie or the TV series Mr. Bean. There's also the cartoon, and they are all quite popular. It's one of his most popular characters. But personally, I found that his best work was done in the British sitcom The Blackadder, which kind of took place over different periods of the British history. And you can see how Rowan Atkinson is capable of portraying completely different characters, because Mr. Bean is a goofy, silly guy who doesn't really talk much, but his character of Blackadder is something quite different. And even the character of Blackadder kind of changed through those ages. In the Middle Ages, he was more of a goofy character, more similar to Mr. Bean, but later he was more of a cunning character, always coming up with different plots and trying to trick people. Now I'm shading this jacket here a little bit. Initially I shaded it very carelessly, because I knew that I would be able to blend it very well with Q-tip. So I'm not overly concerned with the texture here, because I know that I'm going to soften it, and I'm just going to keep softening the edges like this to create a vignette. After that, I just added some suggestions of some shapes like lapels here. That's probably going to do it. I'm not going to try to make it any more complicated than that, because like I said, I don't really like focusing on the clothes when I draw portraits. That's one of the reasons why I prefer vignettes, because they allow me to focus on the elements I like, and they allow me to simplify things that I'm not particularly interested in drawing, and they also allow me a little bit more freedom with the composition. Just putting down some finishing touches on the portrait and moving on to the rest of the clothes. I have to shade this white shirt just a little bit, very lightly around some of these shadow areas under the collar. And once I do that, and once I do a little bit of blending with a brush, I can finish it up with the tie. But I needed to make sure that there is enough contrast between that neck area of the jacket and the head itself, so that the head feels like it's kind of sticking out a little bit, because that's the gesture that he is making. And here I'm putting down some finishing touches on this tie. So the drawing is almost done. I'm just going to do a little bit of cleaning up with the kneaded eraser. The kneaded eraser is great for that because it doesn't leave any residue. And in most cases, if you're right-handed like me, you're going to have to do a little bit more cleaning up on the right side, because that's where there's going to be a little bit more smudging. So all I have to do is to decide where to put my signature. Sometimes that's not easy to decide, because you have to decide how it works better with your composition. Here I'm just going to push the vignette a little bit more to this direction here. And then I'm just going to put my signature here in the lower right part of the drawing. So that's it, the drawing is finished. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a like, and check out my other videos. And if you want to see longer videos, more content, real-time footage and things like that, you should check out my Patreon, because that's where you'll find it. So I hope you like this portrait of Mr. Bean. I'm going to see you in the next video. Bye for now.